Is that you were, I mean, I don't want to stress that coat, but that was quite a style, that was quite a statement.
Well, I mean, that was the Superfly era.
Yeah.
And there used to be two shops in Fort Worth that specialized in Superfly clothing. And I got that coat at one of those shops.
That
So-
was that was fantastic.
But it went to Goodwill.
Yeah.
Nobody claimed it because I think they put it in the rag bin. But
Who was the reporter in the opening report?
Jay Milner
I thought it
was
Jay.
the original Fort Worth reporter
Okay.
for Newsroom.
Okay.
And they started a series where they were going to follow other reporters around to see how they covered their beat. As it turned out, they only did one. And the Star Telegram insists that that was my screen test
And
because
you were hired.
because they offered me a job.
Well, that was in July of 1972, and you were hired by KERA in October 1972. So it wasn't just like the next week, but it was.
Well,
but
I
you
was actually
obviously made an impression.
I was actually offered a job right after then. It was before Jim Lara left, and I didn't accept it. I wasn't ready for television. I didn't go into journalism to be in television. I was a writer. I was a newspaper person. So I said no. And then by October, Lee Cullum had become the city editor, as we call it, for Newsroom. And she asked me if I'd come to work, and I said yes.
To fill in the blank, Jay Milner, the reporter in that episode, became the publisher of the Iconoclast, which was the Dallas Alternative Weekly after Dallas Notes, and then it was the significant Dallas Alternative Weekly before the Observer for, 15 years probably.
Exactly,
So,
yeah.
and so Jay was the reporter then. I thought that's who that was. A little bit of Bob Ray's background. He came to the Star Telegram out of college. That was in June of 1969, if you don't mind me giving the year.
Hey, I'm old. I admit it.
And he talked about he'd written a letter to the editor. He'd actually written two letters to the editor, to the Star Telegram. He wrote one actually in 1963 when he was a youngster at I.M. Terrell after the Kennedy assassination. He wrote a letter to the editor that was a poem. The headline was "Filled with Pain." I was very sad as the day passed on, but I had to realize that a great man was gone. My heart was filled with pain. I was in a daze all day. The man we welcomed that morn in Fort Worth had just passed away. Now we must pray for this great, great nation and ask God to have mercy on this new generation. Bobby Ray Sanders, I.M. Terrell High School, December 11th, 1963 was
Oh my God.
the first time you were in the Star
I'd
Telegram.
forgotten that.
Then you wrote a letter to the editor again in 1967 about race riots. That was when you were at North Texas, and that was published. But
Right. I had, as I mentioned, I often spent my summers in Detroit. I have an older sister in Detroit, and I'd go up every summer on the train. And that summer of '67, I didn't go because of the riots, but I went that Christmas. And I ended up interviewing a lot of people who had participated in the riots or who had been victims in the riot. And I ended up writing about that. But before I got there, I had written an article saying that we need to collect our thoughts and ourselves. And the Star Telegram printed it on the front page of the paper.
printed it on the front page with, I noticed back in those days, with your home address, which I thought was pretty risky at the time. So I thought, Bob Ray Sanders on Carson Street. I thought, oh, well, just in case anybody wants to go see, and have a visit with this young man. So,
Well, in those days, all letters to the editor were printed with
with a home
addresses.
address. Yeah, that was
Because that's how we identified that they were real people.
Well, of course, then you came out, the Star Telegram out of college, and you were there for 3.5 years until you went to KERA. We talked about this story from the courthouse. The first thing they did apparently was put you in the courthouse, and you became one of the courthouse reporters. I noticed Terry Kelly of the Fort Worth Press. My friend Terry Kelly was your competitor, who
Right.
was smoking and had on the floral print tie and shirt and all that. I don't remember the other reporter.
Yeah, I mean, the other person reporter wasn't Carl Friend, who was with the Morning News.
Was it, that wasn't Z. Joe Thornton, was it? Who was it?
No, that wasn't Z. Joe. I can't think who that was.
Who that
but,
was either.
But
What-
we had a room about this size that all 4 reporters who covered the courthouse fit in. That was a press room.
Uh-huh.
And so we rarely had good quality conversation with our sources unless we left the room.
Well, of course, you all went out, and the point you made in that episode was that you have to be there. And when Terry, I believe it was Terry, said that he's got more energy than the rest of us, you know, you have to be there asking questions and listening in order to get stories. And I thought, you know, what a lesson for reporters today.
Well, you know, it's true. And actually, I revealed later on who one of my main sources was. I called him my deep throat. And his name was Mr. Mills. He was a shoe shine guy. Mr. Mills, I made it a point, every time I went to the courthouse, the first place I'd go was to the shoe shine stand in the basement. Because by the time I got there, he had already shined the shoes of most of the public officials. And as they did in those days, they talked, you know, openly, assuming that he wasn't listening to them.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, then when I got there, he would say, "Well, the sheriff just left here." And you know what he said. And that's how I got a lot of my information. But also the sheriff and others, and I was truthful in this. I was warned that the courthouse was the most racist beat, that the newspaper had. But they were going to send me down there anyway. And they said, if nobody accepts you, they don't accept the Star-Telegram, and we'll act accordingly. But they did. Sheriff Lon Evans called me Bobby Ray, and he would call over to the press room and said, "Bobby Ray, yes, sir. Why don't you mosey on over here to my office?" And I'd go to his office.
Because
And
they
we-
all wanted to be in the paper.
Oh yeah, but the thing about it, when I get there, or a couple of times when I got there, he said, "Okay, I'm getting ready to go down here to the little boys' room, and don't you look at that folder on my desk while I'm gone." I'm going to be gone for about 15 minutes, but don't look at
Yeah.
that folder on my. And one of those days, it was there were sealed indictments from the grand jury.
Mm-hmm.
And when I called the paper, it said, "We got like 15 people being indicted." I mean, it's a secret indictment. And of course, the news editor saying, "If it's secret, how do you know it?" I said, "I got a source,
Yeah.
a very good source."
Yeah.
And so, and that appeared on the front page of the paper the next morning.
It was interesting in that interview that you said at the time that you thought that people wanted to be more helpful to you because they didn't want to seem racist.
Yeah.
You still think that's
I know it's true.
okay?
We had some racists
Oh my
who, were,
gosh!
who were in charge of several offices in the county.
Well, the courthouse, you know, we still say it's stuck in the 50s. Back then, we all said it was
Oh,
stuck
without
in
a
the 50s.
doubt. So, but I had people sort of bending over backwards to help me. So and the thing about the courthouse too is that, and this is how I got my feel for political reporting, because every major office was a political office,
Right.
and of course they couldn't stand each other.
Yeah.
The DA hated the sheriff, the tax assessor hated so and so you walk into those offices, and they're all telling on the other.
Of course, this is one of Bob Ray's predecessors as a Star-Telegram courthouse reporter was Bob Schieffer, who went on to CBS. And, you know, Bob said what's great about the courthouse is there's 56 elected officials up there, and they all like to gossip about each other. So, you know, everybody will always talk about everybody else.
That's exactly what I found.
Is there anything else about that story? How do you feel that that plays now? It's almost exactly 50 years later.
Isn't that amazing? I was shocked because I didn't know they had that story. In fact, I'm shocked that they had any of these. I thought they'd all been destroyed because in those days at Channel 13, our things were stored.
You didn't try to destroy these.
No, I mean, I would have destroyed that code if I could have if I'd known it existed. But no, I mean, our things, we didn't have really a secure place of storing things. We had an old warehouse, a tin warehouse, and no temperature control. So I assumed all of those things had been destroyed. I had no idea that they were over at SMU. I knew that SMU had some of the things from our archives, but I didn't know they went back that far. So I was surprised that that still existed.
Well, I know people may have some questions. Let's talk about a couple of stories that you worked on there. The 7th Street Gang, I feel like I have to start at the beginning for a Dallas audience and explain that the 7th Street Gang was the term for all the bankers and power brokers who really made all the decisions about how Fort Worth was going to be run. D Magazine did a very good story about the same time about it. Of course, Amon Carter, Amon Sr. died in 1955. They kept showing Amon Sr.'s bust in there, but by this time it was Amon Jr.
Amon Jr. was my publisher.
And Babe Fuquay, who were dominating all the decisions about Fort Worth. So that was who the 7th Street Gang was, and nobody really wanted to talk about it. Definitely not the Star-Telegram. So you just kind of hinted at it by showing us the street.
Yeah, I mean, what I did was I said, I'm going to tell this story without naming names. I did name Babe Fuquay's name with the Fort Worth National Bank. But for the most part, I just showed the places. And this is where the power is. They have their slate cards. They do this thing. They decide who's going to be on the city council. It's a decision that's been made. They send out these, cards, and everybody says, okay, this is who we support. And so all I had to do, and again, I don't know why I picked Shaft as music, but I think I just wanted to say, and of course, and this is the thing about Channel 13. In those days, nobody really checked your stories. And so you could get away with saying bad mother.
Yeah.
And then shut your mouth. But the other thing was this, is that at the time that we did that story, I didn't know that the Channel 13 officials, Bob Wilson, our station manager, and Ralph Rogers, our chairman of the board, they had been talking to all of these people, the same people I was talking about trying to get more funding from Fort Worth to get a new antenna.
Support KERA. That's
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we needed it because the reception was bad in certain parts of Fort Worth, particularly on the west side, where I lived at the time. You could hardly get, and I didn't realize that until somebody said, you know that Channel 13 is trying to get money from all those people you just got through talking about. I said, no, I didn't know that, and it was amazing. I think that story aired on a Friday, that Monday, and I usually got to the station around 4:30 for our 4:30 meeting every day. And Bob Wilson, our station manager, and y'all know who Bob Wilson is. You know his sons, the 3 Wilson boys, who are all actors now. But Bob came to my office as soon as, not my office, but it's my little cubicle way in the back. As soon as I got there, Bob showed up. I said, uh-oh, it's bad. And he just walked up and he said, great job, Bob Ray. I turned around and walked out.
Everybody figured they better beef up that signal so they can watch the stories you're doing, so they can see what you're doing. That was 1975. The other stories, let's see, there was you in the water garden. Was that part of a story about the water garden, or what was that?
Yeah, I
What were
did
the
do
other
a story
stories?
about the water garden. Keep in mind,
The water garden is a major part of Fort Worth. The southern end of Fort Worth is a Philip Johnson architecture water feature.
Right. I mean, and Philip Johnson was one of the architects that several of the prominent people like Ruth Carter Johnson, who spearheaded that. She was head of the Amon Carter Museum, and became a friend of mine early on. And part of it was because when I was a Cub reporter, and she and a bunch of we call the little old ladies in tennis shoes, who were always doing things, and they were trying to save the river. The Trinity River was a sewer, basically, in those days. And they were trying to save the river. They're going to beautify it. And because I was a Cub reporter, they sent me, hey, you go deal with these little ladies in tennis shoes and write stories about it. And I went in and I became friends with all those little ladies, including Ruth Carter. She was Stevenson by the time she died, but she was Amon Carter's sister, and she adored me. But it was because I told their story. And of course, now what's happening, all of the improvements on the Trinity River, they started.
Started with that
And they
whole
built
water plant.
and then the water garden was an incredible feature. It's 4 acres or so, right in the center of downtown Fort Worth, where Hell's Half Acre used to be.
Where all the saloons and brothels. and-
Yeah, and so that's what it replaced. But that goes to Ruth. And I did a story basically showing Dallas. Fort Worth knew about it, but Dallas didn't know about the water garden. So that was really to show Dallas, look at what Fort Worth has built.
Then Dallas did Thanksgiving Square, which didn't quite compare to the water garden.
Still doesn't.
Still doesn't. Were there other news stories? What were the other stories that we saw little clips of or vignettes? You recognize
Oh,
anything?
golly. I mean, a lot of what we did, because Newsroom was the place when you came for real issues. And a lot of the issues with integration, racial conflict, all of those things. And I came right at the time. In fact, two of the first people who came to visit me my first week at Channel 13 were Al Lipscomb, who was a firebrand. He had seen me, and he really took a liking to me immediately. So he came down to say hello. And so I became almost his mouthpiece in a way on Channel 13. And Renee Martinez, who had just been appointed to the Tri-Ethnic Committee by the judge when they were trying to integrate Dallas schools. And Renee came, and so I became sort of like the voice for the Black and Hispanic community of Dallas, even though I was supposed to have been covering Fort Worth.
Yeah.
But I would get all of these calls from these folk, and of course when Santos Rodriguez was killed, and they were in our neighborhood. I mean, Channel 13 is located in Little Mexico. We knew that family. And I covered that story from beginning to end. In fact, was just there this past year when they dedicated the statue to Santos, and had a chance to see his mother for the first time since they had the 35th anniversary of his death. But I was the one who was chosen by the community to speak for them. And so that's some of what you saw there. But we had town hall meetings, something no other stations did, where we brought opposing views into the studio. I mean, there's one case where Al Lipscomb gets up and says to the person, I think with the housing authority at the time, I'm not going to take this anymore, man, because you bullshitting. Mm-hmm. And so all the people around, but it's live television, so you can't do anything about it. And we were the first ones to start having candidate interviews.
Right.
I mean, everybody tries to do that now, but nobody was doing that then.
You were doing that in the fall of '72 when you first started. I found ads, see Bob Ray on the Candidates Forum, fall of '72. So you were doing, that was the first election I covered. That was the first election you were part of for KRA. So.
Yeah, in fact, and that's part of what we did. I mean, there are a lot of KERA people in here now, and they can tell you that part of what we did was to present those forums, and I was often one of the people doing the interviews.
Well, and let's let people ask questions. You have questions about some of either the Jay Milner's news story or some of Bob Ray's stories that you saw here today.
And by the way, I want to point out Mark Birnbaum sitting up there.
Well, I was going to wait about one question,
okay,
but say that Mark Birnbaum, we see Mark Birnbaum and Bart Weiss here, who did the great video of Hate Mail, which is on Art and Seek, which is about Bob Ray's career as a radio talk show host,
Right.
and all the hate mail you got, and your all the friends you made on KLIF.
Well, Mark also did the first documentary on the Kimball Art Museum, which won several awards, as I recall. So,
The one piece of video that I wish somehow still existed is the first night of the first KERA auction. When Bob Ray auctioned off the dashiki off his back.
oh God.
He didn't take it off on camera, but it was toward the end of the night. Remember how crazy Paul Bosner was as you were doing that?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, people were calling in. I mean, the auction, we did auctions for a week to raise money for the station, and we had all these things, and somebody called in and asked to buy my dashiki, which I auctioned
How
off.
much, yeah, how much did you get? Do you remember?
You know, I don't remember exactly, but it was a Dallas Cowboy who bought it. And I'm trying to think of his name. He's an Anglo guy, big. I think he was like a offensive player, but anyway, yeah, we did crazy things in those days. in a way, and some of you are old enough.
Pat Toomey, I bet. I bet it was Pat Toomey.
Could have been.
He was from, he's a smart guy, Stanford. He's probably,
Oh, okay, but
Pat would have done.
But in those days, it was almost like we were the Little Rascals. I don't know how many of y'all remember the Little Rascals or Our Gang Comedy. I mean, we were running around and we were coming up with ideas, and then suddenly somebody said, "Let's do a show." So, and if you came up with an idea, for the most part, you were allowed to do that. I mean, I'm sure it's changed a lot now, but in those days, we were able to do some things that people just didn't do.
That is exactly the way I heard my friend Bill Camfield describe Slam Bang Theater. And
On Channel 11,
yes, that people, well, nobody from management would tell them not to do anything, so they just did everything. And they would say, go fill up some time, and so they
And
would
we
do whatever they
watched.
could. But yours are obviously higher, much more highbrow audience for that.
yeah, well, we did have a great audience because on Newsroom, in addition to what we did, we opened up the last 15 minutes of the show to feedback, which meant the audience could call and ask us questions. And the thing with Jim Lehrer and with Lee Cullum, when they ask you one of those questions from the audience, I mean, if you didn't know, you say, "I don't know." And then they would say, "But you'll know tomorrow."
Yeah.
So, I mean, you often got an assignment on the air to find out what that listener needed to know, and we did. That's what
And
we
come
did.
back and report back, and Newsroom would just go, kick around. It was like being in a newsroom where you just went to everybody's desk, and it was a great show. It was a great,
Well, that was the idea. The idea was that we were reporters coming into our news editor, and the cameras were around, and the audience was eavesdropping on a meeting with reporters and their news editor.
Is there another question? Anybody from KRA or about the news reports? Yes.
Rob.
Bob Ray, I'm interested in your thoughts about what it was like to go from being a reporter to actually working with and managing other reporters in your role at KERA, News Edition, and all the other things you did at KERA. But that transition from being out on the street to being a manager of other reporters, I'm curious.
Well, I mean, I owe that to Ed Pfister, who was our manager at the time. Bob Wilson respected me and all that kind of stuff, but I don't know that Bob Wilson ever saw me as a manager, and I never saw myself as a manager. I never managed anything. But once we started the radio station, I did things for the radio station. I mean, it was just natural for me. We did Saturday blockbusters where we took 11 to 12 hours on one theme, and we just did that. And I would occasionally do that. I would do stories for the radio station. And one day Ed Pfister called me in and said, and because we were losing the original manager of the station, and it was assumed that the program director, who was then program director, would become the new manager. And that's what I assumed. But Ed Pfister said to me, he says, I mean, it seems to me that you really like this radio station. I said, yeah, I do. I mean, I have fun with it. He said, how would you like to manage it? I said, what? No, I said, I'm not a manager of it. And he said, well, nobody is until they do it. And, but it was right at the time when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS, because everybody who was a manager in public broadcast at the time had never managed before. And that's true with a lot of media folk. I mean, that's true in
Right.
newspapers.
We don't know anything about business or management or anything
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that. It
But-
shows on a regular basis.
But they started a program where they would send a group of us to Harvard Business School for a few weeks. And, I mean, intensive program. It started at 8 o'clock in the morning, went off until 8 o'clock at night from these Harvard professors, where we learned budgeting, number one, which I certainly didn't know anything about, and how you manage people, all of those management skills. and we came back, and and they sent it to other places, like University of North Carolina Business School, for example. So I got some little training, and then I learned on the job. But part of my thing was, I mean, I knew people. People came to me, and that was true at the Star Telegram too. For some reason,
30 years at the Star Telegram.
yeah, total, yeah. But people would come to me and say things, and Angie is clapping. Angie used to have to keep me organized because Angie was my executive assistant, and she would have to tell people no because she said I never knew how to say no, and then she'd keep my schedule for me, and she'd keep a list of everything. So she kept me sort of grounded in a way. But other than that, it was listening to people around me, my colleagues, and trying to be fair. That was the other thing. How do you be fair? And it's tough. I mean, it's tough managing people. Rob, I remember you came as an intern, as I recall.
Right.
And but we had people came. Rolando Blackman of Mavericks was my intern. Butch Johnson of the Cowboys, who came and wanted to work at KERA Radio, and I hired him as a jazz person. I mean, he didn't know much about jazz, but hey, he was Butch Johnson, so you put him on the radio.
It is so difficult for me to begin to explain to someone who's not from here who Bob Ray Sanders is, because I say, well, he was a reporter, but then he became a television reporter, but then he became the station manager, but then he became a radio talk show host, but then he came back to be the newspaper vice president. And I tried today to think of anyone in media who has had such an impact across both cities in this market. And I know that I remember that Blackie Sherrod started in Fort Worth and was well known in both cities. There was a news anchor, the only one I could think of, you all may think of others, but Chip Moody was very prominent in Fort Worth before he came to Dallas. But I don't think either one of them had as long a career and as meaningful a career as you had. I can't think of another member of the media communications person who's been involved in print, television, radio, across both cities.
You mentioned earlier Bob Sheaver, who
Right.
had covered Vietnam when I first
But
got to the
totally
Star
Fort Worth,
Telegram.
never had a job in Dallas at all.
No. I mean, well, he did Channel 5 for a little bit, but so Dallas, but no, he didn't come to Dallas.
Yeah, so that's, is there anything else? Let's see, anybody have another question? Yes?
I think of Bob Ray, and all the things that you've already talked about, but I think of one of his greatest accomplishments was bringing Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee to the television program, television format through with Ossie and Ruby. How did that get started, Bob Ray? That put you in a whole different, you were executive producing that series.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, no, I never thought I'd be executive producer of any national TV show, much less with Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee. But the way that turned out, we were doing several special programs, one on health, one on something else, and we would try to hire a well-known person to come down and moderate that program or introduce that program. And Ossie had come down, he had been hired to come down to do the health program. I mean, and we shoot it all in one day, you know. You hear the intros, it's maybe 4 or 5 shows, but you do all in one day. Well, at lunch one day, because I had just become manager of the radio station, he and Ruby used to do a thing on black radio stations, national black radio stations, where they read poetry and stories. And it was presented by Kraft. I'll never forget it. It used to come on late at night on the old black station KNOK here. And at lunch one day, I went down to Ossie and I said, Ossie, can we get copies of those shows that you and Ruby did on the Kraft program? Because I'd love to run those on KERA radio, whether in the morning, on Sunday, or at night, or whatever. He says, no, he said, we don't own those. I mean, those are Kraft's, and we don't have any control over those. He says, but I'd really like to do that kind of thing on television. I went to Ed Pfister again, and Ed Pfister you think they're really serious? I said, I don't. He says, go to New York and ask him. I went to New York, met with him and Ruby, and came back to Ed and reported. And then Ed said, what do you think it would take to do a 20-minute pilot to show to the rest of the stations to try to get this to become a national program? And David Dow, who was the producer that I was working with too, we came up with $10,000. Ed said, okay, you got $10,000 to produce a pilot. Alex and Ruby came down, we did the pilot, showed it to the rest of the stations, and we got funding from Alcoa for that first season, and we ended up doing a show. And again, we really had no money. I mean, we had no money. All of the stars, and we got great stars, Cleavon Little and people like that, Gil Scott-Heron. We could only pay scale. I mean, and scale in those days was like $1,200 or something. And we had them for a week to do the tapings. And they came down, not because of me, but because Oz and Ruby asked them. And to this day, I mean, it was the most amazing 3 years of my life because we did the writing in New York at their house in the summer. I was staying in a hotel about a mile away from their house in New Rochelle, and spending that time, creative time. And to this day, I'm still very close to the family, and I mean, they were just amazing. But that came about on a whim. The Little Rascals, let's do a show.
And speaking of the arts and culture side of Bob Ray, we didn't even talk about, you wrote one play? How many plays?
I wrote two that were produced, like citywide. I mean, I used to write church plays.
Yeah.
Because when I was growing up, we'd go to the Baptist bookstore, and they all had these plays about young white kids meeting at the malt shop, which we didn't have. And I said, okay, I think I can do better than that. So I started writing plays for the church. And then I just started writing other plays. Sojourner Truth Players in Fort Worth, Curtis King, who does the Black Academy of Arts here, was part of that whole thing. But he's the one who got me to write the first play that we did in Fort Worth, I think on the centennial in '76, I think it was.
And you wrote about arts and culture at the Star Telegram too. And
Yeah.
of course, became such a figure in arts, and it brought leadership to the Dallas arts community here. So,
Yeah.
Someone in the middle had a question.
Yeah, I just was curious, this has nothing to do with journalism. After you wore that shaft coat, did those stores pick up business? Are they still?
Well, it's interesting because the two stores that I mentioned, one was on the south side, and I can't think of the name of it, but it was owned, or at least operated by black people. The one downtown was owned by a Jewish guy who sold things that only black people would buy. So, I think I got at the store on the south side, and it was the chef thing. But hey, I don't know. And by the way, that day, we shot that on a Sunday morning when the streets were clear in downtown Fort Worth so that I could actually get in the middle of 7th Street. It was 22 degrees that day. So I needed a coat. I mean, I wasn't trying to be Superfly. I needed that coat. And as I said, I eventually gave it away to Goodwill, which put it in their trash bin.
Every cowboy at the stock show's got to have his duster. That was just your Western duster for the day. Yes.
In 1990, the Clayton Williams, Ann Richards, I remember watching KERA, and was this like an aha moment for you? Because to me, I'm a North Texas guy, but after, Clayton Williams way ahead in the polls, miles ahead for whatever that means, and all of a sudden sticking his foot in his mouth, the rape is inevitable, and then you asked him about some proposition or amendment, and he couldn't define it. You were like, did I hear that right? He said, I can't, just show it to me.
Well, what happened was, and this was the Friday before Election Day, and Clady was winning in the polls, and I was interviewing, I had already interviewed Ann Richards, and Ann, by the way, sort of friend of mine, but Clady Williams And luckily I read that he had already voted. No, that was the thing. And there was a proposition, and I can't remember exactly what the proposition was, but there was a proposition on the ballot, and I asked him, how did you vote for this proposition? Clayton Williams says, no, I didn't vote for that proposition. I said, but you voted, right? He said, oh, yeah, I did. I said, so did you vote for it or against it? He said, I think I voted for it. I think I voted. There are people who said that moment changed the election because that is a soundbite that was repeated all over the weekend leading up to the election.
I remember him responding to you, well, if you put it in front of me, I can give you an answer.
Yeah. Golly, you got a great memory. That goes all the way back to, well, the election when Ann Richards was first elected governor of the state of Texas. And by the way, I could not believe that anybody, especially George W. Bush, could beat her in the second term. But it happened.
You
But I had
know-
my moments with him too. But
Well, you know, and of course you have friends in both parties, but I think the most important thing to say now is that, I mean, you have always, you had friends of the Democratic Party, but I mean, now we have to just all be friends of democracy in general. And, you know,
Oh, without
I mean,
a
now, now what we all are just we have to believe in our system of democracy and our system of democratic elections.
yeah, and then with local government, which is supposed to be nonpartisan, by the way, city council, mayor, all that. I mean, it's not Democrat or Republican, but nowadays the school board is political because you got people showing up with these crazy ideas about what you're supposed to think as a superintendent or a president of a school board.
Yeah, I sat in the editorial board with Bob Ray some years, and I can guarantee you he always spoke up for the underdog. But he also said very often, he said, let the people speak. And, you know, let's see how the people vote and who the best representative is. And let's let the people speak, and let's let the people have their say.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I still believe that. It's hard sometimes, I guarantee you.
Any other questions? This is, Margarita, go ahead.
So my question is about cultivating sources and how you did that and how did you navigate your relationships? It's very hard to do that, I think.
Yeah, it is very hard. It's over time building trust with people, and then showing them that you will protect them as a source. And of course, in those days, when we went with sources as the main ingredient of a story, we couldn't go with just one source as a rule. We had to go to somebody else to verify it. Today, you'll hear, rumors have it and those kinds of things, or a source told me. Well, we had to really verify those facts. But that comes with years of experience and showing that you can protect that source. And we were dealing with things, and particularly, dealing with the criminal justice system, for example, getting things from the DA's office and then getting it substantiated by someone else in the courthouse, whether it's county clerk or the sheriff's office or a lawyer in some cases. But as I suggested, with Lon Evans, the sheriff, many times the source was the actual person in charge of that event or that case. So it was pretty easy, but you never revealed that source. And as I said, until probably like 2 weeks before I left the Star-Telegram, I identified and he had died by then, Mr. Mills, the shoe shine guy. I revealed, this is my deep throat. And his family said, he always liked you. I said, yes, he did.
And you always get to know the administrative assistants and
yeah,
everybody.
definitely.
I mean, you just always want to be really nice to everyone you meet because it's all the people that can help you or can share information.
Yeah, those clerks,
Yeah.
for example, in the courthouse, by the time, I came, they knew what I was looking for. So they'd already have it pulled out.
Yeah.
I didn't have to search all those records. They'd say, I think you want to see this one.
Yeah.
So for a long time, you've had a front row view on issues of race in this area. and it's been a struggle for a long time. During the Black Lives Matter, it seemed like there was a ray of hope. I just wondered how you feel about that struggle and where we are and where the future of that struggle is.
Well, I've always tried to be a hopeful person. I've had hope. And keep in mind, I grew up under Jim Crow, so I've seen the gamut, and it's very. There was a time when I really thought, I said, we're going to make it. A long time ago, there was a time I said, all we have to wait is a few more people to die, and it's going to be all right. But you quickly realize that even though people die, they've already passed on their prejudices and all of that to other people. And I realized early on that there were young people growing up with the attitudes of their grandparents. In the last 4 years, my hope has dimmed. And I'm sad to say that, but that's true. I thought I would live long enough to see the change that I thought was coming in 1975, in 1985, in 1990. I realized that we've regressed so much that we're almost back to 1950. And that's scary. And for all of those, I see this young lady right over here. She may live to see it. I won't. And I've accepted that. The change that I wanted to see come. Yeah, I was hoping with Black Lives Matter. I said the country is getting it. Then we got the backlash. And you got people teaching hate again. And it's coming from the highest chambers in our government. So I hate to leave it all on a negative note, but that's just the way I feel. I think we got a long ways to go, and sadly, as I said, I'm old enough that I know I won't live to see the change come.
Well, Bob Ray, I'll just add that, it means that we were getting close.
We were close.
It means that we were always going to hit this speed bump where we were really close to getting along and putting an end to a lot of our past ways. But the people who felt threatened didn't want things to change. The people, the generation that felt like they were losing something or that they were being cheated out of something didn't want things to change. And so we were always going to hit this pushback in this situation in Texas now, where there's an older generation that runs things and a younger generation that wants it run differently.
And sadly, there's a group of people, I'm talking about leadership people, who've identified that thing that they call inferior or threatening to other people. They have taught fear in a way that I never thought I would see in America again. I never thought I'd see somebody tell you that you've got to fear me because I'm trying to take something from you because we have different skin color. I thought we had passed that, but it's being taught. It is being uttered, and people are being given permission to spread those kinds of lies and those kinds of evil things and evil ways. And it's catching on. When you see young people talk about the critical race theory, and then you ask them, what is that? And they say, oh, I don't know, but it's bad. I don't know what it is, but I've been told it's bad, and they're trying to infiltrate my kids' minds with this stuff. You're trying to make my kids hurt. Oh, please.
Someone else? Yes.
He's-
Before we go away, Bob Ray, we do need to really thank the people at SMU Jones Film, because without their hard
Yes,
work,
indeed.
I think we've got to thank
Where are they back? I just met some of them earlier, but
Scott Martin, Jeremy Spracklin. Are they in the booth? They're in the booth. I want to tell you all about SMU Jones Film. They didn't even give me a handout of PR about it. I'll just tell you about it off the top of my head. This is the most fantastic archive that we've ever had in Dallas-Fort Worth of video, film, everything. They have all the Channel 8 archives that are they're so helpful. They'll punch up. They're just organized by date, but they have tried to pull out significant news stories. They have a really comprehensive YouTube and Twitter networks. If you can search YouTube or search Twitter, you can find almost anything that was a significant news story in the 60s or 70s. You can find how Channel 8 covered it. You can find a lot of KERA clips now too. They have the KERA archive. Now we have two great news film archives in Dallas-Fort Worth. We have, SMU Jones has the Channel 8 collection, and the Portal of Texas History at UNT has the Channel 5 collection. UNT is trying to raise quite a bit of money to digitize the Channel 5 collection and make it more searchable. SMU has chosen to keep things simple. They have a bunch of stuff over there, and if you give them a date, they'll go look for it. And but they have done a fantastic job of in every way of bringing. You saw it this week, the coverage of the Rangers, the first Rangers game 50 years ago. It was Channel 8's story that was carried on all the sports channels again nationwide, saying this is how Dallas covered its first Major League Baseball game 50 years ago, and it came from the SMU Jones Film Collection. And so if you have a chance to thank the people at SMU, they have a great collection. They're being great guardians of it, and everything you can do to use it and encourage them and thank them for everything they're doing. Without them and the hard work they did, we wouldn't have these clips of Bob Ray today. So a big round of applause for the Ponies. And thank you, Bob Ray, and thank you to the USA Film Festival for making this possible. This is from KERA.
Where are all the KERA people? I see all of them back there, but
Everyone from KERA, stand, wave.
yeah, they're all, oh Lord.
Bob Ray,
Thank you.
we'd like to see you clogging to the Yellow Rose of Texas with those if you can. No, I'm kidding. It's great to see you again. I love seeing you every time.
Thank you very much, sir.
Every time you
Appreciate
want to
it.
have Fort Worth guys come over and talk, we'll be happy.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bud.
Let's have a round for Bob Ray Sanders.